Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, wherever you are connecting from. Welcome to the Global Health Center of the Graduate Institute in Geneva for the presentation of a research project lasted 2 years, it's just concluding now, on the pathogen and benefit sharing. The project was funded by the Swiss Network for International Studies. My name is Gianluca Burci. I'm an adjunct professor of international law here at the Graduate Institute, and I was a co-investigator in the project. The principal investigator, Dr. Suri Moon, the co-director of the Global Health Center, will introduce the methodology and the object of the project more in depth in a few minutes. However, to start with, let me give you two words of introduction, both for those of you who are interested in the topics, but maybe not particularly initiated, but also to set some context of why we even have undertaken this project. So the object of the project, as the title says, is the deals with the international sharing of human pathogens for public health purposes and the sharing of benefits deriving from the utilization of pathogen samples. So sharing pathogens and sharing other genetic material is nothing new. It's part of a sort of ongoing scientific collaborative practices. I would say it's in the DNA of scientists and researchers to share this kind of resources among themselves and within the network. But there is also an intuitive need of intuitive importance, I would say, of the need to share pathogens for health protection purposes. For example, to investigate new pathogens and to develop countermeasures, diagnostics, therapeutics, vaccines, and the global collaboration that takes place every year to arrive at flu vaccine is a classic example. The importance of open and unimpeded sharing has become even more acute and higher with the increasing number of emerging and re-emerging diseases. Think of all the various strains of pandemic influenza, the various coronaviruses, but also with globalization accelerating the pace of international spread. And COVID-19, I think, is a very graphic example of how quickly a pathogen can spread around the world. At the same time, however, the politics surrounding this issue, but also the international regulation that influences pathogen sharing, has become more complex and more articulate. As shown not too long ago, about 10 years ago, by the sudden problems in sharing viruses of pandemic influenza and the need for WHO to take over and negotiate a dedicated framework, the so-called PIP framework, to address this issue. So our project, therefore, is a reaction on the one hand to the lack of empirical knowledge on what actually happens outside the influenza field. And second, also to take into account the increasingly political tone of some aspects of international sharing. The project aims at gathering evidence on sharing practices and drivers, both for samples and benefits, both in general, but also with regard to two case studies on the 2014-2016 Ebola outbreak in West Africa and the 2015-2016 Zika outbreak in Brazil, of which we'll say something in a few minutes. But also to reflect on the state of the field and on possible improvements, since, as you will see, it's far from perfect. So today we have gathered quite an impressive group of colleagues to discuss our findings, and this is the program of this event in a nutshell. First of all, we hear about introductory remarks by Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, the Chief Scientist of WHO, that I hope will is joining us, and I will introduce in a moment. After that, Dr. Moon will give you a more detailed introduction on the objectives and the methodology of the project and on the project team. We will then hear from two members of our research team that Dr. Moon will introduce in a few minutes, that have participated in the case studies on Ebola and Zika, respectively, followed by an overview of our main findings by Anthony Rizik, a doctoral candidate in anthropology here at the Graduate Institute and the research assistant for our project. Following that, we have invited two representatives of the diplomatic community in Geneva that have helped us with the project, but were not part of the project team. And they will bring their own perspective from a sort of longer distance, if you want. And we will then open it up for questions and answers. We invite you to ask questions using the chat function, not the Q&A function that will be disabled. And so we hope to have a good discussion for the final 20 minutes or so, and we conclude around 6 p.m. Let me now introduce our first speaker, Dr. Soumya Swaminathan. She was appointed as the first chief scientist in WHO in March 2019. So she has the science division that was created by Dr. Tedros to strengthen the core scientific work of WHO and ensure the quality and consistency of its norms and standards. Before joining WHO, Dr. Swaminathan had more than 30 years of very distinguished career in India and internationally, both in clinical care and research. Her last appointment before joining WHO as a secretary of the Department of Health Research and Director General of the Indian Council of Medical Research. And for more detail, the bios of the participants are available on the web page of this event on the website of the Global Health Center. So I will stop at that and I will give the floor to Dr. Swaminathan.
Thank you. Thank you, Gianluca, and thank you, Suri, for inviting me, and good afternoon to all the participants. This is a very interesting project on a very important topic, and I've been aware of it for the last year or so because we discussed with Suri when she was just at the beginning of this project. So I'm looking forward to hearing what you found. As you know, for the COVID pandemic, I think has brought to the fore the importance of pathogen sharing. This is something obviously that has been discussed for a long time, especially with respect to the Nagoya Protocol, which, as everyone knows, is within the Convention of Biological Diversity and which really governs the use of all genetic resources from a particular country to ensure benefit sharing. So there's the access and the benefit sharing provisions. And pathogen, you know, for better or for worse, pathogen were also considered as part of the genetic resources of a particular country or a region or a geography, and therefore fall under the Nagoya Protocol. However, we do know that, you know, there is a provision under Nagoya for public health emergencies, public health needs, and that there is the possibility of having sample sharing when there is a public health need. But this is where I think there is an opportunity to discuss and to create something that a multilateral treaty or a framework, which then under the Article 4.4 could actually create a space, create an opportunity for pathogen samples to be exchanged. Now, for WHO, you know, both access and benefit sharing are very important and equally important, I should say. Timely access is important because we know what you can do if you have timely access to samples. Now, of course, with science and technology advancing, it is true that genetic sequence data is getting more and more important. And in fact, you know, we are marveling today at the idea of having a vaccine for this new virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus that's been not only created, but has completed clinical trials and is now being given the first human non-trial participants to get the vaccine today in the UK of a new mRNA vaccine that was only possible because of the sharing of the genetic sequence data in early January by the Chinese scientists on a variety of databases that were publicly available. And this, I remember very clearly because I remember we got the sequence data on the 10th January, the same day it was submitted to GASAID, it was made available the same day. And on the 13th of January, we had the first diagnostic test created by Christian Drosten's lab in Germany, the protocol for it, as well as the reagents and things. We could make it available within 48 hours to all countries so that labs around the world could start setting up diagnostic tests to pick up this new infection. So from diagnostics to obviously vaccine development, to the fact that today we have, close to 300,000 sequences in the GISAID platform, which is now being used for a whole lot of analytics by countries. And these sequences are coming from over 100 countries, thousands of researchers collaborating. And this collaboration has been extremely productive because we've been able to track mutations. Countries have been able to track how these infections came in and went out, and where there are clusters and how the clusters are being created and which are the hotspots. And even after vaccines are rolled out, it will be important for us to keep tracking these sequences to ensure that the mutations are not interfering with the region, the spike protein against which the vaccine is being developed, as well as for therapeutics as well. It's important because many of the targets nowadays are developed using bioinformatic techniques. So it is clear that to find a solution for a disease, you need to understand the pathogen, you need to have access both to the genetic sequences, but also to the physical samples, because there are many assays that need to be run for which you actually need the virus in culture. And for this particular pandemic, I guess, it distributed itself around the world so that every country in the world today has access to the virus. But not all outbreaks will be like that. There are outbreaks which will be limited to a few countries or one country, and where the immediate sharing of samples would be important in order to let science progress. So that's the most important thing, is to understand why timely access to samples is important. It's to do all of these things: the diagnostics, the vaccines, the drugs, the epidemiology, the tracking, etc. Now, what about the benefits? The benefits could be, of course, a lot of the benefits are non-monetary benefits, and we have to remember that. They are in terms of the scientific collaborations leading to papers which further the understanding, further the knowledge. You have a scientific collaborations leading to further further research. You have academic publications. You have capacity building. You have all of these other kinds of non-monetary benefits that accrue from sharing. And then, of course, there are monetary benefits if and when products are developed, vaccines or diagnostics are developed using these samples. Then that is when then the question of how do these products, which may lead to monetary benefits for some countries or some companies, how should they be shared, and what would be the benefit sharing mechanisms? Now, you probably are all aware that the World Health Assembly, in 72nd World Health Assembly, asked WHO to undertake a survey or to do fact finding on the current pathogen sharing practices. What are the enablers? What are the challenges? How has the Nagoya affected this in countries where Nagoya is in place? Whether there are country legislations and so on, and to collect concrete examples of any diseases and situations where this is either facilitated or had a negative impact on access and benefit sharing. And so we undertook a survey. Of course, it started at the end of last year, and we ran into COVID-19, so that I think was challenging for many of the stakeholders to respond. However, we had about 3,000 people actually begin to respond to the survey, and we got a reasonable number of responses from member states, but also from the private sector and from civil society, NGOs, etc. So from a number of different stakeholders. And we basically have analyzed that. We'll be presenting it back through the executive board to the World Health Assembly next year, essentially showing, a wide variety of experiences and also a fairly widespread lack of knowledge, especially amongst academics and scientists about Nagoya, but also a gap between the Ministry of Health and the Ministry of Environment and the other ministries which handle these regulations within countries. So there were examples as well that were cited, and especially around influenza, where we know that that's the only one where there is an internationally accepted framework, the PIP framework, for the sharing of influenza strains of pandemic potential. But even with that existing mechanism there and a framework, there have been recently some instances of countries um, of there having been delays in the sharing of samples of influenza, which is not good because obviously then it impacts the development of the vaccine strain for every year, which needs to be based on the data that countries are submitting. So even something as well functioning as the influenza network has been impacted, and then we found that there are different mechanisms for different pathogens, and there are networks like the polio network. There's TB, there's malaria. So there are several networks which are operating, either through bilateral MTAs or through systems that have been set up a long time ago where there's been trust built up between the different laboratories and the researchers. So again, I think trust plays a very important role in some of these operations. Now, looking to the future, I think it's important. Also, Dr. Tedros has already announced the fact that WHO proposes to host a biorepository. This was actually a suggestion that was made by some of the member states, but this will be a voluntary mechanism for countries to deposit the virus, and in this case, it's a SARS-CoV-2 virus. Switzerland has kindly agreed to host the first of these biorepositories. There could be more in the future, it depends. And a few countries have also expressed their willingness to share the viral specimens for storage in the repository and then for use by WHO as the need arises. Of course, there are many details that need to be worked out on how these specimens will be received and stored, and then further onward sharing, what terms and conditions that will be done. But I think this is a good first step to creating at least a voluntary mechanism for sharing. And hopefully this can be expanded and worked on to create a mechanism for sharing of all pathogens which are likely to cause big outbreaks, epidemics, pandemics, etc. So it's potentially feasible to imagine that if there was a declaration of a public health emergency of international concern, that this would then trigger the need for countries to start sharing these samples with the WHO in order to enable the kind of things that we talked about. And as I said, we of course need to start thinking also about the benefit sharing, and WHO would pay attention to that aspect as well. But it's too early, it's at a very early stage. The DG just announced it at the last assembly in November, and we're still working, and we will discuss with all the stakeholders as well as, of course, with the member states as to how they envisage that this could be taken forward to really have the maximum benefits from a setup like this. So perhaps I'll stop there, Suri, and turn it back over to you so that you can share the results of what you find, and I'll try to stay on for as long as I'm able to.
Thank you so much, Dr. Swaminathan, for those very thoughtful remarks. And I think you've laid out very nicely the broad range of issues and the high stakes, really, of trying to identify solutions for better governing pathogen and benefit sharing. And I think many people are also quite curious about, of course, the recent announcement about a biorepository potentially here in Switzerland. So thank you for sharing some further information on that. What I would like to do now is to turn to presenting our research results. And as you will have seen in the chat, the full working paper is now available online. Please do continue. I see there's a robust conversation that has started going on the chat. Please continue to feel free to use that. We'll turn at the end of the session to some Q&A. So first, let me explain a little bit about the project itself. And what you can see at this image at the top of the screen is the idea that there are at least two bodies of international law whose goals intersect with the issue of pathogen and benefit sharing. We have the goal of the international health regulations, which is, of course, to better protect the world against outbreaks, and the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol, which has multiple goals, one of which is to reinforce sovereignty of countries over their genetic resources. And it's fair to say, I think, that pathogen and benefit sharing both overlaps with the goals of both of these regimes, these sets of international rules, but it also falls in between. And there are no clear rules that ensure rapid, reliable, and fair pathogen and benefit sharing. So this was really the motivation for the research project. When we looked at the literature, we found that there was quite a heavy focus on the legal obligations of different actors and the political dynamics around a few high-profile cases, such as the Indonesian decision to suspend influenza sharing back in 2007, which led to the PIP framework. However, there was a limited understanding of practices, what actually is done by researchers and governments. There was also a limited understanding of what are some of the informal norms driving practices, so not just the international or national laws. And what this meant is that the policy debates happening both here in Geneva as well as elsewhere were happening on very thin empirical foundations. And of course, that's no way to have a robust policy debate, and there were many important unanswered questions. And so this really was what got us started. We were fortunate to apply for a grant and to be successful in applying for a research grant from the Swiss Network for International Studies. And we'd like to thank very much SNIST for their generous support of this work. You can see on the screen the research team, including my colleagues whom you've heard from Gianluca, you'll hear from Anthony, Anna Bazurki, who's behind the scenes, and of course our colleagues in Liberia. You'll hear from Mosoka Fala, but I also wanted to thank Tolbert Nyenzwa and Joseph Sieka in Liberia. In Brazil, you'll hear from Gustavo Mata, but we also wanted to thank Esther Paiva for all of her contributions. We also want to thank, of course, all of the project advisors, and you'll see we had a mix of people coming from government, intergovernmental organizations, and from academia. Finally, we reality checked some of our findings over the summer in a workshop of policy practitioners. So all of these inputs have helped us to develop the findings that we're sharing with you today. I'm going to give you the conclusion first. I've been told that's an effective way to communicate. And the conclusion is basically this: everybody knows this needs to be done, but nobody really wants to do it. And that applies to the question of governing pathogen and benefit sharing. In terms of the objectives of the project, we were hoping to clarify current practices, basically what's happening. Again, it's hard to get a clear picture of this. And second, to identify potential solutions. So you'll see that what we did was we triangulated among a number of different data sources, because actual practices of pathogen and benefit sharing are not done in the public domain. These are not visible, I would say. So we looked at a number of different data sources. Of course, the academic and grade literature. We looked at how influenza virus of pandemic potential is shared through the IVTM mechanism. You'll see a little bit more about that in a little bit. But primarily, we relied on interviews. We conducted 86 interviews in total. You can see on the right-hand side the distribution. About over half of those at the international level, and then we conducted 2 case studies, the first of Ebola in Liberia and the second of Zika in Brazil, and you'll hear first from the case study authors. We also examined material transfer agreements, about 26 of those, but I'll get into just a second what some of the limitations were. So indeed, lots and lots of challenges. As I mentioned, there's no centralized data source on the shipment or movement of pathogens, nor on the benefits that are shared in relation to those pathogens. The reconstruction of what's happening based on interviews is necessarily limited by our sample. We had difficulties interviewing, in particular, 2 stakeholder groups, commercial actors in key countries in the global south, despite our requests for interviews. We had challenges with the fact that signed or executed MTAs are usually kept confidential. So about 1/5, 20% of our analysis was based on executed MTAs. The remainder are models. This is, of course, a very politically sensitive issue. And we only focused on human pathogens, although there are some interesting practices for plant and animal pathogens that I think others will, I hope, take up for further research. Last but not least, as Dr. Swaminathan mentioned, we focused on physical samples, which remain very, very important. There's still no replacement for some research purposes, no replacement for physical samples. But of course, the issue of genomic sequencing data is extremely important. We did ask systematically about this, but this has not been the focus of our research. But we'll say a few words at the very end about GSD. So let me launch the sharing of our findings by just setting the scene, which is that PBS is happening today in a climate of uncertainty. And I think this is well captured by just one quote from our many interviewees, where we had one person, a scientist, sharing, if I share my influenza virus, what's happening? Do I lose ownership or not? This is the uncertainty, and it makes things more difficult. And this is a similar sentiment that we heard from many, many people that we spoke to. There's uncertainty for a number of reasons, and one of which, of course, is that the rules that govern PBS are in flux. There's tension that is anticipated between the formal norms. We already mentioned the IHR. My colleagues have mentioned the PIP framework, the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, and of course, national laws, which are very important. And also tensions anticipated with informal norms that drive scientific practices of sharing. These norms are changing, they're complex, they're layered. It's very unclear what different actors have to do, should do, and are doing. So indeed, with all of this uncertainty around rules and practices, many of our interviewees called for increased coherence and clarity in the governance of PBS, and we'll come to that again at the very end. But without further ado, what I'd like to do now is to invite our first case study presentation from Dr. Masoka Fala, who will be sharing the case study on Ebola in Liberia. He's currently a lecturer at the School of Public Health at the University of Liberia's College of Health Sciences. He's the principal investigator on a number of important follow-up studies of survivors of Ebola in Liberia. He's also a faculty member at Harvard's Medical School and the founder of the very well-respected NGO Refuge Place International, which focuses on women and children's health in Liberia. So Dr. Fala, over to you to share our findings from the Liberian case study.
Thank you very much, Shuri, for the kind introduction. We're really going to the experience we have with pathogen sharing in Liberia perspective and the Ebola samples. So probably we have a timeline on the key points of outbreak of Ebola in Liberia, West Africa. Next, please. Basically, we had the first case of Ebola in Liberia on the 28th of March 28. We don't have any kind of framework in terms of, basically, we essentially don't have in-country diagnostic capacity. So basically, for instance, all of our Lassa specimens were sent to Sierra Leone, all of our potential yellow fever and polio sample were sent to Institute Pasteur in Dakar, Senegal. So basically, because we even had in-country capacity for diagnostics, and the issue of a framework for pathogen sharing was not available. And so we had a little bit of a lab that got started, supported by Global Fund, but there were no mechanism in place what to do with those specimens. And then we got into a panic emergency mood. We had a first imported case from Guinea into Liberia in April, 6 cases, one of them left and came into Monrovia, and there was a need to test. Eventually, at the initial stage, the first specimen were taken across the river in Guinea, and they went to Guinea, France, to be tested. Obviously, at the time, it was the issue of response, then looking at the issue of the fate of the pathogens. And so the outbreak became a priority. Next slide. So basically, the basic we're trying to lay is that before and during most part of Ebola, we never had a pre-existing infrastructure for diagnostic purposes or for the issue of pathogen sharing. So here comes a complex issue of an emergency response and what to do with all of the samples we're getting. And so basically by August, we had almost 1,000 cases among WHO declared PHERC for Liberia for the first time. Samples are tested at LIBR. Basically what we did was to take the proposed HIV/AIDS lab that should have been used for HIV/AIDS testing through the Global Fund and through support from the US NIH and the US Department of Defense, took that lab and We took an old HIV lab and converted it to testing. Eventually began some of the testing in country. Later on, mobile labs came from the CDC, the Department of Defense across the country. All of those periods, the essence and relevance of samples were not made known to us. Some of the samples were sneaked out in the middle of the night. Some of those managing the treatment center took samples out of the country. And so in the midst of that, and some guidelines, we tried to create the MTA. Started. The National Ethics Board was started before COVID-19, before Ebola, but the mechanism of material transfer agreement was not in place. It was in the midst of this outbreak that we initiated that. Thank you. Next slide. Can we shift to the next slide? Yeah, okay, good. And so as we progress along the line with the outbreak, around September, cases are going to increase September to December of 2014. Then the need to centralize the samples at the National Reference Lab. So the National Reference Lab was also funded by the Global Fund for the first time. In September and October, we saw a peak. Late October, we saw the outbreak plateau. The samples were now centralized at one place from across the country. We introduced a mechanism for transport that had been used in other African countries called Riders for Health. They were brought in with an elaborate transport system to move samples to the National Reference Lab. Then along the way, the samples were there. The issue of biosecurity started to come up. The US got concerned. There were incidents. And so the discussion started to transfer the sample to the US. I must admit that the samples were transferred on a very strong agreements with the issue of benefits. And so benefits were put within the agreement, benefits for capacity billing for publication. I must admit that I think a large part of that was informed by my discussion with Suri. Suri had come for a big conference with her on West Africa, looking at her experience, and she had spent a day together. And she already gave me some hints on some of the benefit one could get. And so I went as one of the major negotiators on the samples transfer agreement, and Liberia benefited a lot in terms of that agreement because of those discussions I had with Suri. And so afterwards, when the samples moved to the US, there were multiple resurgences, the samples were transported, but then the Popular Institute was created, a form of US CDC, NIH. And one of our mandates was to establish guidelines for pathogen share, benefit sharing. We had to negotiate all material transfer agreements. So at the time we had to take control. There would be no specimen to leave the country if we did not feel that the country would benefit, and if Liberians would not be sent. So whenever a specimen left, for example, we're doing some work with Colombia, we had to send two of our staff to go for training. And you can only move specimen if it cannot be used or analyzed in country. And so because of those backgrounds, we begin to build our capacity with support from US CDC and WHO. And as I said earlier, we moved the specimen from Liberia to the US because of biosecurity issue. There was a big concern. We lacked the infrastructure for a biorepository. At the time, we now have one viable biorepository with all of the necessary security feature in place. And so we're going to work with other countries in West Africa, NDDU at Oxford to look at a regional biobank. So this is a timeline of a complicated situation that we had to, as I said, work through response, and I see that manage the pathogen, but we learned as we went in the midst of the emergency. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Fowler. I think we'll go straight to Dr. Mata's presentation and hold the further comments until the end. And so I wanted to mess around with my paperwork. And sorry, introduce Dr. Gustavo Mata, who co-led the Zika virus case study in Brazil, who coordinates the Zika Social Science Network. He's a social psychologist by training and a researcher at the National School of Public Health of the Oswaldo Cruz Foundation. So Dr. Mata, over to you to share what we learned in Brazil.
Okay, thank you, Suri, and thank you everyone here. It's an honor to take part of this team in this research. So as Suri presented, we did some interviews in Brazil, especially scientists and also institutional representatives from some scientific institutions. So we are many questions to share with you. Well, I will present very quickly some contents about our timeline of Brazil PBS during Brazil's Zika outbreak. So just to let you know, because some people probably don't know about it, specifically how Zika increased in Brazil and the repercussions of microcephalic cases in October of 2015. The idea in the beginning of 2015 is when Zika came to Brazil, that Zika was a light dengue. It's not a serious disease. And then 6 months later, we have a kind of a microcephaly epidemic in our country. So, and cell samples largely at the discretion of scientists. So later I can talk a bit more about this. Next, please. So in November of 2015, well, Brazil recognized the determination between Zika infection and microcephaly. And also we declared the public health emergency in national concern. And then in February, WHO announced the international, the public health emergency in international consensus. So the whole world wanted to have Zika samples. It was a high demand. And coincidentally, the new law of biodiversity comes into force in November 17. So in 2015, it includes microbial species as part of genetic heritage. So the new biodiversity law is also concerned in, I think that the principal focus was in natural resources. And so it also includes microbial species and human species as well. So Zika sample sharing initially helped due to confusion around the new law in absence of CGEN registration system. It was a system that you can do bureaucratically to share sample and internationally. But it's not, it's important to say that it's not prohibitive, but there's a lot of confusion that time. So, and in July and onwards, so post-Zika, we can say, or can have a question, it's a new normal. Zika outbreak has subsided. And also we have not so much funding to continue scientific research and also to support families and children affected by Zika. It's a very, very serious issue. The system became available in November 2017 and improved it to accommodate scientists. Negotiating benefit sharing through the use of MTAs becoming a common practice. But there's a lot of other questions that I would like to explore and share with you. Next, please. It's something about context and more to explore some analytical dimensions. In that time, Brazil, for the first time, became a big laboratory during Zika outbreak. Ethical issues and international predatory are common in that moment. So just to let you know, we identified informed consent in Mandarin among families in the northwest of Brazil. Brazilian scientists responded rapidly and consistently at this moment. So there's a lot of lack of confidence in that moment, how we can share not just samples and pathogens, but also data. Also in that moment, we have to, it was compulsory to receive international funding to share data. And also, it's also included in many research groups to constitute a biorepository. So it was important to comment. And another dimension that I would like to comment is political and economic crisis during that moment and until now in Brazil. Brazil had 2 presidents, 1 impeached, and 4 ministers of health in the period of Zika outbreak. So there are very unstable context and political and economic as well. So the government stated an economic austerity policies in 2016. In that moment, we have cut 44% of our science and technology funding. So, and now we have almost something about 70% of scientific and technological funding. International funding was essential in that time to strengthening scientific response. Also, another issue is social participation and engaged research. So women movements and mothers affected by Zika complained about the lack of participation and consent. Society must understand which benefits we'll have when share biological samples. The next, please. Next, please. And again, coming back to the question of legislation and the normative turning, the new Brazilian diversity law, it is in this context that it's why important to talk about the context. It's some analytical dimension as well. The question of the Nagoya Protocol debate, because Brazil didn't sign the Nagoya Protocol. This is another issue to be faced. And the question how to improve equity and sustainability among low and middle-income countries in the global health research. So I think that some questions that I would like to share with you and discuss later. Thank you very much, Suri, and you are very welcome with your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mata, for that overview of what took place in Brazil. And I think you can see, the audience can see when we look at these 2 case studies side by side, a number of interesting parallels, actually. I won't go into them. You can read it in a little bit more detail in the full working paper about these, but it's clear that the value of pathogens certainly skyrockets for both sides in the middle of an emergency. Both sides, in terms of sending and receiving countries, are under intense pressure to negotiate some kind of agreement. This is not an ideal situation, neither for sending nor for receiving countries, and that we have seen in both case studies the evolution of systems that are born out of crisis. That after a public health emergency of international concern, you do have new arrangements put in place. But of course, we cannot wait for that to happen in every country of the world before we find broader solutions at the international level. So now to take us to the international level is Mr. Anthony Rizek, who is a PhD candidate here in our Department of Anthropology and Sociology. I think it's fair to say, or no exaggeration to say, that he has been the fuel and the engine of this research project. Thank you so much, Anthony, for all your contributions, and take it away.
Thank you, Suri. So I'm going to be going over our main findings and their findings on pathogen benefit sharing and their implications to its global governance in this presentation. If we can go to the next slide, please. I'm going to be starting with our analysis of the influenza virus traceability mechanism, which Suri mentioned in the beginning, which is, to our knowledge, the only publicly available database on the movement of pathogens globally, specifically in this case on the movement of influenza viruses of pandemic potential. Next slide. The full analysis of the IVTM data is in the working paper, which is now available on the project website. But what we wanted to emphasize here is that from the data from the IVTM, a relatively few number of countries were actively sharing influenza samples in the 20-year period, 1998 to 2019 that we studied. You can see on the left the number of IVPP sending countries, and on the right the number of IVPP receiving countries. Even though we don't have, there isn't any empirical data of the same quality on the movement of other pathogens of pandemic potential, the data from the IVTM gives us a glimpse into how pathogen sharing is taking place worldwide. In the next slide, in the next slides, I'm going to be talking a bit more about findings from our interviews. I'll be starting here with some main points about pathogen sharing, and in the next slide, I'll talk about benefit sharing. In terms of pathogen sharing in general, our respondents spoke about how the drivers for pathogen sharing are complex and interacting. And these span from instrumental drivers, which have to, the next slide, please. Instrumental drivers that have to do with outbreak response, so needing to share pathogens in order to respond to ongoing outbreaks. But other drivers were also discussed, and these included political, economic, and security drivers. And the main driver that was emphasized to us was scientific norms. As mentioned before, the norms of open collaboration and sharing among scientists, the role of trust and personal relationships, and long-term collaborations played a definitive role in the movement of in successful pathogen and benefit sharing. In general, with the pathogen sharing, we found that interviewees tended to have a clearer picture of how pathogens were being shared and where they were being shared. When it came to benefit sharing, it was not as clear. Overall, we found from our respondents that a critical mass of respondents reported consensus on the need for fair and equitable benefit sharing when it came to the sharing of human pathogens. But there was a large variation in different understandings of what benefits mean and what would be a fair and equitable benefit for pathogen sharing. We've grouped these different understandings under four themes here in no specific order. The first one was benefit sharing as a global good. So engaging in pathogen sharing in order to, as one respondent said, advance public health everywhere. A second area of understanding benefit sharing was academic recognition, so sharing credit, co-authorship, and collaboration. A third area of understanding benefits was benefits as tools that would support preparedness and response. So this included capacity building as benefits, for example, as well as access to information and access to countermeasures, such as vaccines, pharmaceuticals, and diagnostics, as well as discussing benefits in terms of economic returns, so financial benefits. I should mention here that a large number of interviewees from lower and middle income countries tended to emphasize capacity building, especially as a key benefit for the sharing of pathogens, and the need for benefits to be related to preparedness and response to outbreaks. In the next two slides, I'm going to be focusing a bit more broader on what respondents reported as broadly working and not working when it came to pathogen and benefit sharing. In general, researchers reported being able to acquire samples when they needed them, that people tended to get what they want. This tended to be more in non-outbreak settings rather than during emergencies. As mentioned before, sharing was reported to be based on trusted interpersonal relationships and long-term collaborations. However, some respondents did note that reliance on interpersonal relationships do not always work out well in sunny weather, quote unquote, but do not always work out when it comes to emergencies. A key finding from our research is that in our interview narratives, there seems to be an evolution in the norms and practices related to benefit sharing, where many respondents explained to us how practices that used to be acceptable in the past, such as, for example, going to other countries, collecting samples and returning to originating countries for research, are no longer as widely accepted as they used to be in scientific practice. And this is perhaps also reflected in a wider use of MTAs globally and a wider involvement. So MTAs are material transfer agreements, contracts that are signed by scientists and institutions that contain benefit sharing provisions, as well as terms and conditions for pathogen sharing. And it's also reflected by the wider involvement of legal offices. In terms of what is not working, well, one key issue that was pointed out to us by many respondents is the role that disparities in technology and capacity worldwide plays in pathogen and benefit sharing, where many scientists or countries who would rather keep samples in country for their own research and development feel a pressure to share samples, especially during outbreaks, because of a lack of local capacity in order to do the diagnostic and research work, and including human capacities that are needed. Another area that was a disruptor of smooth operating of pathogen and benefit sharing identified in our research was biosecurity and biosafety concerns. Similar to before, there are very few BSL-4 laboratories worldwide, and with highly pathogenic samples, there may be a desire to share them, and this has contributed to discourses nationally and regionally for the need for biobanks and biorepository capacities, including for highly pathogenic samples. Also for commercial interests, our respondents tended to observe that sharing was easier in academic settings where benefit sharing provisions were more so being negotiated. Whereas with commercial interest, there was more mistrust and hesitancy and higher stakes, especially as related to such benefits as intellectual property rights. And finally, a large number of respondents reported that there is a lack of clear and comprehensive arrangements or regulations, that there is a growing mosaic of rules stemming from the coming into force of the Nagoya Protocol that is becoming challenging to navigate. And especially here, institutions that are larger with large legal offices tended to report being able to navigate these complex rules, whereas smaller and more medium-sized institutions tended to find these changing rules to be a higher, more so of an obstacle to participate in the global sharing of pathogens and benefits. So in light of the identification that the lack of clear governance rules was a priority need, we did talk to a lot of our interview respondents about the policy options. And these policy options ranged from the more formal options to the left to the more informal options to the right. The more formal options included new multilateral negotiations for frameworks that are similar, for example, to the pandemic influenza preparedness framework, as well as options related to the Nagoya Protocol, including including setting up specialized international instruments that are in the spirit of the Nagoya Protocol, while some respondents did discuss pathogen carve-outs as a policy option from the Nagoya Protocol. Because of the long time that it takes and the difficulty it embedded in negotiating multilateral frameworks, we did also discuss informal policy options with respondents, including, for example, codes of conduct and ethical guidelines for pathogen and benefit sharing that can be backed by governments and civil society organizations, as well as international organizations that codify these changing norms around pathogen and benefit sharing. Given the more widespread use of MTAs, the development of standardized MTAs may smoothen out the process of ensuring rapid and reliable pathogen sharing while also ensuring fair and equitable benefit sharing, and a traceability mechanism similar to the IVTM data we showed at the beginning of my presentation, would show us more empirical data on the global movement of pathogens and related benefits and help inform decisions going forward. However, I should point out that no single policy option had a clear consensus from a critical mass of our interviewees, and these policy options are not mutually exclusive. Next slide, please. So what are the implications of our research? There is substantial agreement from within the limits of our sample that pathogen and benefit sharing should be on equal footing. Next point. Moving forward, PBS, as the case studies have shown, there's an importance, and this was also shown in our interviews, that PBS should be instituted ahead of outbreaks rather than before outbreaks, as well as the importance of a traceability mechanism that can not only give us needed empirical data, but also be a stepping stone towards multilaterally negotiated frameworks. A third important point that was discussed moving forward is that genomic sequence data need to be kept in mind as PBS systems are discussed. And lastly, that PBS systems going forward need to be consistent with international regimes related to both the international health regulations and global health regimes, as well as the biodiversity regime and the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Nagoya Protocol. In terms of governance, given the data that small groups of countries are actively involved in the sharing of influenza samples, a small but representative group of stakeholders could take the lead in beginning to negotiate new multilateral frameworks. Because outbreaks do not wait, especially as the COVID pandemic is showing us, it is possible to have both rapid, reliable, and fair pathogen sharing, but this requires us building the global governance system to address it. I just wanted to thank all of our research participants who took time out of their schedules to participate with us in interviews, as well as participants in the July 2nd workshop. The report from that workshop is also on the website of this project, as well as SNIS for funding this research, the project advisors who advised us throughout the process, as well as the staff of the Global Health Center who supported this project over the last 2 years. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Anthony. Brilliant presentation. I think we heard, received a lot of information to set the conclusion and the findings of the project in the proper context, both at a general level and with regard to the 2 case studies. I see also on chat there is a lively conversation going on, many questions. That is excellent. And so before we come to the Q&As, as I anticipated at the beginning, we have asked 2 colleagues from the permanent missions in Geneva, so from the, if you want, diplomatic side, intergovernmental and political side of this conversation, to give us the perspective, and in particular to see what the high-level comments are on our findings and what the views are on the possible next steps. Where do we go from here, having seen at least what we perceived as the pros and cons of the situation as it stands. So the first speaker is Eero Latinen. He's a counselor at a permanent mission of Finland to the United Nations in Geneva. But he's not a diplomat. He's actually a medical doctor. He's a specialist in family medicine. He has a PhD in public health. But he's an old presence, not old age-wise, of course, but in terms of seniority in Geneva. He's been in Geneva for about 10 years, so he really seen a lot of the developments that have taken place in WHO and around WHO, and has been also an advisor at the Ministry of Social Affairs and Health of Finland on health promotion and policy developments. So without further ado, I give the floor to Eero. You are muted. We cannot hear you.
Yeah. Now you can hear me. Yes? Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Gianluca, and thanks to Graduate Institute for carrying out this study. I am convinced that the results will be very helpful in our future discussions. Now, to start, I just would like to stress that although I have for many years had the role as the EU burden sharer on PBS-related dossiers, what I am today saying represent only my own personal views, and they may differ from the positions of the European Union and of my own country, Finland. So first, I would say that this debate is very timely. The present pandemic has made it evident that we need to start a proper discussion on PBS, and that this discussion needs to take place in the context of global health. It will be very interesting to see whether the pandemic has influenced the approaches countries will take in this regard, and so far we have not had that discussion, and we don't see indications on changed position. One of the new initiatives that was already mentioned by Dr. Swaminathan and that we need to follow very closely is the idea of a WHO repository of biological materials. there I would assume that some kind of formal agreements need to be made, although the idea is that donations would be voluntary, but that's another issue. Anyway, so, but there's another point that I need to stress, and that is that we need to also remember that there is another area where access to genetic sequences, free access to genetic sequences is important, and this is the formal work on communicable diseases in their surveillance, diagnostic and treatment. I say a couple of words of that in the end of my presentation. So in emergencies, PD access to pathogens is vital, and the IHR review committee has today in its open meeting said that access to causative agent is the causative agent is key in responding to international health scourges, and therefore they consider that new discussions on new solutions are necessary. At the WHO a couple of weeks ago, the EU said that had this pandemic been caused by an influenza virus, we would have seen a very different response. We might have had an early warning from the GISERS network. We would have had a very structured response ranging from the risk analysis, detection and sharing of the virus to benefit sharing. WHO would have received 10% of the products that would have been produced based on the access to the pandemic virus, and there would have been a financial reserve for immediate needs and to start procurement for of more commodities. However, I will not speak for or against the so-called PIP model for PBS, but I would like to stress that in my view, the main lesson from PIP is that the more is agreed internationally in advance, the better, faster, and more structured response we would have in the case of a health emergency. Now we know that the international legal environment on access and benefit sharing has changed, and that the PIP framework may not anymore be the single self-evident solution to access and benefit sharing in connection with an influenza pandemic, as it used to be before the existence of CBD and the Nagoya Protocol. So we need indeed to start the discussion, and in my view, the after COVID debate on PBS, we should start from identifying first what is needed, and then look at what can be achieved with reviewing by reviewing the existing instruments, such as the IHR, International Health Regulation. And only then we should enter into a discussion on what type of new instrument we would need, if any. So, my personal view is that with reference to the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol so far, it does not really give to me the confidence on finding a solution there. I would also like to echo very much what Dr. Symenathan said about the range of the benefits that needs to be looked at in these upcoming debates. And finally, the free access to genetic sequences for routine work on communicable diseases. So genetic sequences are today used routinely in surveillance, diagnostics, and treatment. And would a free access in that context be limited, we can risk a major problem and obstacle for the technological development there, say alone in the control of AMR. The volume used in this context is very large. The origin of pathogen looked at may be very difficult to identify. and the benefits therefore very difficult to define. So this is a very different area, but extremely important for the future development, technological development of the surveillance, diagnostics and treatment of communicable diseases. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Eero. Excellent setting of context, and in particular on genetic sequence data on GSD. That's something that probably we mentioned and we should have clarified more. It's not that we ignored them. It's that the limitations of a project in terms of funding and in terms of time forced us to focus on sample sharing. We couldn't go broader than that, but we are very cognizant of the totally different dimension that GSD has introduced, or the pace of technological development, and that's definitely something where more research needs to be done. And it's also good, I didn't know about the statement by the review committee today, that pathogen sharing becomes part of the broader reflection on the review of the IHR and the broader global health security architecture. I think that's a long overdue recognition that there is a gap there. Let me introduce a second speaker. It's Igor da Silva Barbosa. He's a first secretary at the Permanent Mission of Brazil here in Geneva. He's indeed a career diplomat. He's been a diplomat since 2008 and has been specializing in intellectual property, trade dispute settlement, which is one of the great passions, of course, here in Geneva with WTO and WIPO, and has worked in the office of the legal advisor of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil. He also has an academic side. He's an assistant professor of international relations at Rio Branco Institute and professor in international law, so a colleague of mine at the University of Brasilia. And he's been first secretary at the Brazilian mission since 2017, dealing mostly with WHO related issue. So Igor, the floor is yours.
Well, hello to you all. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here, Gianluca. Thank you very much, and thank you also to Suri for this invitation. We have been discussing these issues for a rather long time now, and I've been able to provide some inputs throughout the study. So I would like to congratulate also Anthony for being the fuel and engine in this study, as you mentioned, and a very good contribution and a very good input for us that are dealing directly with this issue in WHO and other fora. Certainly, this is going to be a great addition to our discussions. Well, also, as Eero said, despite being currently in the Brazil mission to the UN office in Geneva and WHO, my opinions here are my own. So I've been following this issue for some time, and I've been able to get a good knowledge about what's going on and what I think would be a good way ahead for this issue and how we should deal with this, trying to put into perspective and to consider it all these very complex issues that arise from the matter being regulated by an international treaty that is not directly linked to health, which is the Nagoya Protocol. And the impacts and repercussions that the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol does have to the issue of pathogen sharing. So this being said, what I would like to say, and as you said, Gianluca, I do have a legal background, so I will try to maybe focus my comments that very much on the legal perspective, the way we see this and the way we should try to resolve these issues in a very rules-based approach, and taking into due consideration the existence of the Nagoya Protocol. Because sometimes when we are discussing this matter of benefit sharing, people simply seem to forget that we do have an international treaty that is valid, legally ratified by over 100 countries, that has very clear rules and that had a very beautiful and difficult history of negotiation throughout several years, and we are able to reach a consensus on the principles, the objectives that are enshrined therein. So we do have to take this into account, and we cannot lose sight of these arguments, because the Nagoya Protocol does exist. It's an almost universal treaty that provides for very, very interesting and very balanced rules to govern the way we use and access biodiversity around the world. So this dimension, in our view, should never be forgotten. Even if we take a very close look to the articles that do mention the matter of health, which are articles laterally 4.4 on the specialized international instruments, but more directly in Article 8b. Those two articles, they do provide us with the possibility to somehow take into account the health perspective. But when they do so, and if you take a close look at those articles, they do take into account also the necessity to provide rules to access and benefit sharing whenever someone is accessing these genetic resources that are, in this case here, represented by the pathogens. So in Article 4.4, if you take a look, an international specialized international instrument can only be considered to be so if it does not run counter the objective of the Nagoya Protocol. If you take a look at Article 8b, it says that even in health emergencies, one do have to take into account access to treatments, especially in the case of developing countries. So these rules, they have to be taken into account. And whenever we are watching some discussions about the pathogen benefit sharing, those rules somehow they are considered not fully, but only when they say that health should be taken into account. And then we hear for calls about all the pathogen sharing necessity. Just to be clear, we are not against the necessity of pathogen sharing, as my colleague from Fiocruz from Brazil very well put. We are very much interested in cooperating and be able to make part of this scientific advancements around the world. And this happens with pathogen sharing. But many countries, they do have to be clear on the necessity of access and benefit sharing. And then I would like to stress very much the access part, because sometimes when we speak only about benefit sharing, maybe the lay person or someone who does not follow this issue very closely may think that we are talking about money strictly. And this is not it. Access and benefit sharing, they do bring about questions of countries being able to purchase or to access medical countermeasures once they are developed by those who have received biological samples coming from that country. So this is the issue that happened with Indonesia back in 2007 when the emergency with H5N1, I believe, came about. And also when we speak about benefit sharing, we're also speaking about technological and scientific cooperation. And this is very important to advance the objective that was put by Gustavo Mata, which is this equity in global research. All countries being able also to contribute and to advance its own knowledge. So this is a very important part of the ABS arrangement package. We're not strictly speaking about money. And to be honest, as far as my contacts with the Brazilian authorities go, this is the least of our preoccupations. They are much more concerned about being able to access countermeasures. They are concerned about being able to advance national scientific knowledge to support our institutions. We do have to remind as well, Gianluca and dear attendees, that this pathogen sharing, it does not happen on a void. If you take a look at GISRIS, for example, we speak about more than 150 institutions that are, by the end of the day, supported and financed by national budget, by national money. And somehow this network, it has to be sustained, because even if we take a look at the partnership contributions in the PIP framework, it would be far from enough to support this whole network. So this is national money being put in those collaborating centers to be able to make it viable for us to have this kind of pathogen sharing. So there is this bill, this check that has to be paid somehow, and right now the countries are paying for it. So this has to be taken into account as well. And whereas we do have the interest to cooperate and growingly cooperate more, those different perspectives that are not only about let's share, let's save public health, that we do have to take this into account, because if we take a close look and if we ponder, the benefit sharing is very important for the advancement of public health in the world. Because if we do have benefit sharing, we do have stronger collaborating centers throughout the world, developing countries. We do have shared knowledge. We do have more investment in those centers, so we are able to grow our network. So this has a very important impact in the public health preparedness around the world. So just to be clear that for us, the access and benefit sharing is not only about receiving money from certain companies, it's being able to also to strengthen our own capabilities and to be able to collaborate in a better fashion with the system. So we do have these issues. Another thing that I would like to flag, just maybe for us to end this, just to conclude, it's not clear either what kind of pathogens or what kind of organisms are we talking about. So we have on several occasions flagged this. So what are we going to do? Is it every virus? Is it every bacteria that we were going to have to share? Is it everything that we're going to carve out? So there is no there's no clarity for us about the scope of this pathogen sharing. So this would be important for us as well. And I get very concerned when I hear this conversation about carving out pathogens, because today you carve out pathogens, tomorrow you carve out agricultural varieties, and the next day you don't have anything else inside the CBD or the Nagoya Protocol, and we just lose this very important legal framework. We do have to remind ourselves that also, as my final remark, that all this hurry, all this necessity to just share, and growingly share, it forgets sometimes that for several other diseases, we have been sharing samples for decades now. I'm taking a look at the page of the World Health Emergencies Program, the WHO Emergencies Program, and we do have current outbreaks of cholera, for example. How long have we been sharing samples for cholera, and we still do not have a clear scientific solution for this matter? Not to mention the big three: HIV, TB, and malaria. We have been sharing this samples for decades now, and we reached the point that we don't have medical solutions. So just for your reflection, and also for the public reflection, we do very much favor the necessity of further cooperation, of more profound cooperation, but we do think it's imperative to take all these different perspectives into account. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Igor. I'm going to take over chairing for the last the home stretch, and I really want to thank our two representatives from the diplomatic missions here for giving us a very clear sense, I think, of a number of the issues at stake and the complexity and the difficulties with with finding there is no simple solution, certainly, to this challenge, but there's also no choice, I think, but to look for a solution. And I think the two of you have really explained very well why that is. I wanted to open up the floor, and I have been following very closely in the chat a number of the questions that have been posed and comments, and some of them are factual, and I can see from the attendees we also have a number of world experts actually on these issues. So those of you who would like to respond in the chat to some of the factual questions, please feel free if you haven't done so. Some of the questions have also been answered already, I think, by at least or at least in part by the presentation. So let me turn to one question that I think has not yet been addressed, and I want to address this actually to the lawyers. So I think that would be probably, if I remember correctly, Gianluca and Igor, which is a question that comes from Alex Kong about standard material transfer agreements. And he asks whether, because you have so many different kinds of users, government, academic, commercial, is that a feasible way to move forward? Would that help? Or would it be too restrictive? And I'll ask you to respond very briefly. But indeed, given the complexity of finding solutions quickly at the multilateral level. Gianluca, let me turn first to you, and then Igor, to you.
Well, that was part of our empirical research. And as you said, Suri, we didn't collect enough variety and mass of MTA. So it remains a bit anecdotal what actual practice is. And the practice is often not governmental, is really linked to the policy of particular scientific institutions, research institutions, and so on. I think from the little we saw, that there seems to be a tendency in standardization of the MTAs. And I think it's a logical thing, because some of the issues are cross-cutting in terms of limits in what can be done with the pathogens, of transfer to third parties, but also in retaining some kind of rights, intellectual property rights, and so on. I think that also the PIP framework has shown the importance of standardizing to a certain extent these agreements that now, when it comes to pandemic influenza, are fairly boilerplate. So I think that we are going towards a more uniformity, and uniformity also reflects probably the kind of pathogen, the kind of use, as Anthony said at the end, in a way, what particular purpose does have the transaction. And I think it's a positive development, rather than having a rather chaotic and difficult, unintelligible practice as it's been until recently.
It would be a step forward in your view. Igor?
I would concur with what Gianluca said. Several countries have their own models right now that are sometimes designed by their own research institutions, so they might differ even inside countries. We do have a very big issue, which is language. So I was talking to WHO, and I asked how were they able to translate everything to identify all the legislation that they're going to present in our report for the next board, and they said it's impossible to translate everything. So sometimes we put in Google, sometimes we put here. So the format is different, the clauses are different, and I would say that it could be a good effort to maybe take the PIP framework as an example of having these SMTAs maybe in a template or something like that. As far as the clauses are very well negotiated and cared for. So as not to oblige countries to somehow have to sign what they don't want to, and this is an important aspect.
Thank you. I want to pose my next questions about GSD, genomic sequencing data, which has come up quite a bit. And I'll pose my first question to Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, and then turn to Masoka. So I'm now asking the scientists. Actually, let me turn, Masoka, to you first, which is, if from your perspective as a researcher in Liberia, if you were to generate GSD and share it internationally, do you expect some kind of benefit in exchange for, or in return for that? Is that something that is relevant for you? And I think we still have Dr. Swaminathan. If she's able to rejoin us, I'd like to ask, how important is it that any solution that is found addresses the issue of GSD? Do you expect that GSD sharing will continue to flow freely, as it largely has in this outbreak, or are certain arrangements needed to make sure that that is the way things go in the future? So let's turn first to Masoka.
Yeah, so basically, I don't think the issue should be one of immediate benefit when it comes to genomic sequencing data. The good example, like the Honorable Doctor said from WHO, the power of the GSD is that we are able to quickly know the sequence and develop diagnostic capacity. Diagnosis is critical to contain outbreak. But the question would be in terms of how do you prepare a country like Liberia to have the ability to sequence? So I'm part of the WHO group that are looking at how do we create these early detection centers around the world? How do we build in the capacity, the infrastructure, so that we have a much more diverse capacity to sequence of data from where it originates? The power we have with COVID-19 is that the Chinese sequence the data and share it widely, and we have diagnostic capacity. So I don't think Liberia should think on how do we benefit directly from a genomic sequencing data. But what we should be thinking to make a much more fluid, coordinated system, how do we build this system and infrastructure across the world so where we originate from, we have an access to sequence it immediately and give it to the world. That should be the key to how do we build capacity that is not concentrated in fewer countries. That's the key we should be thinking about. How do we build the capacity and the infrastructure?
Thank you. And indeed, this is a theme we heard over and over again in our interviews. Dr. Swaminathan, would you like to respond to the question? How important is it that we include GSD in the scope of any multilateral solution?
I think GSD is critical now, as has been pointed out, and it needs to be shared. And it's something that you can, because there's no physical shipping of anything. All you need is a platform, a global platform that researchers can upload their sequence data onto. So this is really the most rapid way, and it serves a lot of purposes. Not all the scientific purposes are served, but quite a lot of the initial work can be done with GSD. So I think it's really important. And we already have existing mechanisms that that are working. And I speak specifically of GSAID. It's worked well for influenza for over 10 years. It's worked extremely well for the SARS-CoV-2. So there's obviously something about it that that earns the trust of people who are depositing the sequences in GSAID. And so I would think that we need to have GSAID or GSAID-like platform expand to cover all emergency pathogens. And essentially what it does is not just pool the data in one place, but it does a lot of, it promotes collaboration, it promotes scientific collaboration, and it also promotes capacity building and partnerships globally. So we must look at models that are working rather than inventing something new, and strengthen them, expand them, modify them if necessary, but use those for GSD. There is nothing like that for the physical samples so far. So that's something that will need to be created. But for GSD, I think we need to build on what we have.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm going to address my last question to Gustavo and then Eero. Of course, these discussions are taking place, obviously, not only in the context of the COVID pandemic, but amid quite widespread concern about unequal access to COVID vaccines. Yeah, I think I'll just wrap it up there. To what extent do you see that how we address the issue of access to countermeasures in the COVID pandemic, how will that shape the way this issue of pathogen and benefit sharing gets negotiated in the future? Because indeed, I think as Igor was saying earlier, these discussions don't happen in a vacuum. They don't happen ahistorically, and what's happened in the past very much shapes, of course, how stakeholders see, what are the solutions for the future. So let me first turn to Gustavo and then to Eero, and then we'll wrap up.
Okay, thank you, Suri. Very complex question. so and now more than ever, we need to discuss these issues. So one thing that I think that we have to concern is we have different countries, different health system, and different research systems as well. So for instance, in Brazil, scientific institutions are public, not for commercial use. So more than 90% of the scientific production come from public institutions and public universities. So I think that is one point to highlight. And the second is this production is to offer to our universal health system. In spite of, we also have private system here. More than 70% of our population depends only on the public health system. So saying this, the question of COVID vaccine now, in Brazil. I think in the low-income countries, what we are seeing in Europe, and in spite of the WHO initiative to identify COVID vaccine as a common god and to hide human, now we can see a kind of running who will have first have the vaccine to offer to the population. So more than ever, we have to discuss and to face the issue. So scientific production, samples, and data are not commodities. So we don't have to exchange values. We have to find a way to guarantee the scientific production is a human right to the whole world. So it's not just for vaccine, because vaccine is the point of the iceberg, right? So we are talking about universal health system, access to primary health care, access to pharmaceutical, access to diagnosis, access to respiratory machines. So the entire world suffers a lot with the COVID-19. So especially in Brazil, so we are a very unequal world, unequal country. So the impact on Brazil is expected to be very unequal, but the lack of coordination, not just national coordination, but also a global coordination to respond to COVID pandemic, it would be very important to save lives. So
Thank you.
it's not just about vaccine, it's about human right, so to help.
Thank you for reminding us indeed about the much broader set of issues at stake. Eero, last few words to you. How do you see some of the concerns around access to COVID technologies shaping the debates on PBS to come? We may have lost Eero. Indeed, I'm not quite sure we still have him. In that case, I'm going to ask Anthony to punt, as we have for the last 2 years. Would you like to offer any reflections on this last point, closing remarks before we wrap up our report launch today?
Well, I guess the only closing remark I would like to offer is something I had missed saying in the presentation earlier that's related to this point as well, and to the point on the Nagoya Protocol, which is that in our interviews, there was a very wide variety of responses to the changes happening on the international level. But the different, sort of responses to the Nagoya Protocol coexisted. On both levels, there was concern about the different rules emerging, but also at the same time, a lot of hope among many of the people we interviewed that these changes will lead to a more fair and equitable future regarding pathogen and benefit sharing. So I'll just end on that. Thanks.
Thanks very much. And you've done much of my work for me in wrapping up this webinar and also in running this project, I should say. So let me just offer a couple closing remarks, which is that the title of our paper, everybody knows this needs to be done, but nobody really wants to do it, came from an interview we did before COVID. And I hope this attitude has changed, but we can see why diplomats, political leaders, scientists have been hesitant, I think, to jump into the fray and really commit to solving this issue. It's very, very difficult, complex, and sometimes a very polarized debate. We have been, therefore, I think, at a stalemate, at least since 2011, with the conclusion of the PIP framework. There's been no real momentum to address this, but I do believe that in the current context, with the vast devastation we've seen with this pandemic, with the big concerns about access to countermeasures, we have to find a solution if we want to ensure rapid, fair, and reliable pathogen and benefit sharing in the future. Certainly, it will not be easy. I never think that the job of diplomats is easy, but one of our key conclusions from the study is that it's possible. So the ball is now out of our court, and we're throwing it over into yours. Thank you to everybody. If we could have our closing slide up. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us today. You can learn more about our events and research at the websites that you see here. And we have this Thursday a research webinar focusing very much on this issue of data, indeed, which came up, of course, a number of times. Looking at it from a bit of a different angle, but focusing on the question of the governance of data. So thank you, everyone. Stay safe, stay healthy. And with that, we'll sign off.